Hi, I'm Toby Meyer, State Director for Decoding Dyslexia California. We are pleased to be hosting an interview with Dr. Margie Gillis. Dr. Gillis holds a doctorate in special education from the University of Louisville. She is also a certified academic language therapist. Dr. Gillis is a research affiliate at Haskins Laboratories. Haskins Laboratories has a long-standing formal affiliations with the University of Connecticut and Yale University, and it produces groundbreaking research that enhances our understanding of and reveals ways to improve or remediate speech perception and production, reading and reading disabilities, and human communication. Dr. Gillis holds numerous board positions and is a well-published author and speaker in the fields of literacy and dyslexia. She is a former resource teacher and adjunct faculty member. In addition to her impressive credentials, Dr. Gillis is the president and founder of Literacy How. Welcome, Dr. Gillis.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you today, and thanks to your team, Decoding Dyslexia California. I'm looking forward to chatting.
Excellent. So, Dr. Gillis, can you share Literacy How's story and its mission, and why did you found Literacy How, and what types of services do you provide?
Happy to talk about that. So the history of Literacy How really began in 2000 when I was hired to be a reading fellow at Haskins Laboratories, where I still maintain an affiliation. And I was hired along with a number of other people in the field of reading to take the research from Haskins and other research institutes and establishments and help teachers apply the research in their classrooms. And we got state funding, we got federal funding, and we partnered with schools throughout the state of Connecticut. And basically what we did was we took the research into the classroom. So we were all practitioners. Some of us were special ed teachers, myself included. Others were gen ed teachers. And we all had not only a passion for reading, but also had pretty good background knowledge in the research. And our mission was to help the gen ed teachers that we worked with in K2 classrooms understand the research and understand it enough to be able to apply it effectively. And in 2000, that really hadn't been done before pervasively. That was the year that the National Reading Panel came out with its report. And we had, a lot of evidence from that report, from that work that they did, that there was a plethora of research on how children, and the research wasn't getting translated for teachers in higher ed programs, in their professional development in their districts. And so we really wanted to take a stab at and try our hand at coming up with tools that would help support teachers' ability to learn the research and then, like I said, apply it in their classrooms. And I did that work at Haskins for about 9 years, and we had a good run in terms of what we did. We worked with hundreds of teachers in many districts across the state. We learned a tremendous amount about how to partner with schools, about how to work with teachers in their classrooms, about what kind of materials would be used effectively, and we just did some really very, I think, good work. And we took advantage of the climate in terms of research grants at the time. And then in 2008, the research funding started to dry up a little bit. And I had this cadre of amazing people that I had been working with for 7-8 years. And I could not bear the thought of not keeping the work going. So, but we couldn't exist at Haskins anymore without grant funding. So I took a leap of faith and started Literacy How, based on the same idea of helping teachers in general ed settings primarily, and I'll get to the next part of this in a minute, but helping gen ed teachers to take what we had learned and apply it in their classrooms through what we call embedded professional development. So embedded professional development, as we see it and as we do it, is basically going into a teacher's classroom on a fairly regular basis. So you establish a relationship of trust and collaboration, and you work with the teacher in his or her classroom, and you work over a period of weeks and months and potentially years to embed those practices in the classroom. And the reason it takes that level of intensity and time is because Joyce and Shower's research on professional development has really pointed to the fact that you have to do something 20 to 25 times before it becomes natural. It's part of your repertoire. And so if you just learn it and see something once or twice, you try it, maybe it worked pretty well, but usually not so well, and you say, oh, I can't do that, that doesn't make any sense, you usually go back to your old habits. The expression old habits die hard, there's truth to that in teaching too. And so we know that you really have to get into that classroom on a regular basis, have very deep reflective conversations with teachers to really advance their understanding and their willingness to apply. So having said all that, we took the 9 years, or I took the 9 years of great experience and started Literacy How to continue the work that we began at Haskins. And the person that really influenced me the most at Haskins was a woman named Fowler. And Fowler was a research scientist there, and her dream was to have a teacher training center to involve teachers in substantive ways beyond what most of them get as far as professional development is concerned, to really ensure that the research was put into practice, and given a lot of support to do that. She passed away, unfortunately, at a young age. So I felt very compelled to take her vision and just keep going with it wherever it might take me. It took me to Literacy How. I brought along, I think at the time there were 8 people that I encouraged to come with me from the Haskins project, because they didn't have work there anymore and they were going to be looking for jobs. And I said, no, they can't do that. They have to keep working with me. And it wasn't too hard to sell. And the rest is history. That was July of 2009. So we're going to celebrate our 9th anniversary soon. And I've have more mentors now that I've recruited. And so that's the main story. But what's probably relevant to you and to your colleagues and to this conversation is that several years ago, we also, as a state, were starting to pass some legislation pertinent and specific to dyslexia. And because we were well positioned to take our, work in the general ed sphere and really parlay it, if that's the right way to say it, or at least use it to get us into special ed world. And since many of us, myself included, had lived in that special ed world for many years, it was very familiar to us. It was a natural, progression for us to move into translating a lot of the research that was relevant for reading disabilities and dyslexia, and building content around that, and developing teachers the same way we did with gen ed teachers, to, providing professional development for special ed and reading teachers, so that they understood the principles of the evidence-based practices that we believe so strongly in.
Right. Excellent. So can you just hone in on what services Literacy How does provide?
Okay, sure. So we do a few things. So in the area of professional development, we are continuing to provide professional development for general ed teachers. Most of that is done through a state initiative that we've been directly involved in for 5 years. So the state legislature allocated money to developing a kindergarten through 3rd grade reading model that could be replicated in other schools and districts across the state. And so we've been directly involved in that. We're the professional development arm of that initiative, as well as creating a curriculum for parents and around literacy. So that's the general ed world that we spend a lot of time in. But then, as I mentioned, when we decided that we also had the expertise to develop not curriculum, but training modules for special ed teachers, we now do that work as well. So in that case, what we generally do is we're providing, we have a professional development series, 5 workshops that amount to 30 hours, and that is our basic structured literacy course. And that course provides whoever takes the course. It's not necessarily special ed always. It could be the administrators think that the gen ed teachers need to have background in that, which we love and think is absolutely appropriate. But we do have gen ed teachers, special ed teachers, reading interventionists, reading coaches, the whole panoply of educators coming to take that course to build their background knowledge of what does evidence-based instruction look like for students that have difficulties with reading.
Margie, you talk about the literacy imperative, and what do you mean by this?
The literacy imperative for me is that I used to say 95% of all children can learn to read. And now there's some research that suggests it is even higher than that. So some people say 98%. Splitting hairs for the sake of argument, most every single child can learn to read, regardless of reading difficulties, regardless of zip code, regardless of ethnicity. It, every child deserves to have that skill and ability, because without it, their life is not going to be the same. They will not have the same opportunities. They will not be able to achieve the success. They will not be able to reach their full potential. And we know that the statistics are out there and there's no denying it. So for me, the imperative is that every child needs to have that. It's an inalienable right. It's a civil right. And so in order to get them there, our teachers have to be very well trained. We know from years of research that reading doesn't come naturally. Our brains are not wired to read. They're wired to speak. And without the wiring built in to the system, and without that neurocircuitry that Marianne Wolf and Ken Pugh and other brilliant researchers talk to us about, without having that in place, a child is not going to be able to get where they need to get to. Comprehension will be impacted if you can't lift the words off the page. And teachers just haven't been trained to help kids do that. And what ends up happening oftentimes is the child is blamed. The child is blamed, the family is blamed, the culture is blamed, somebody else is blamed, but the teachers can't handle the fact that they're at fault. And I don't fault teachers. I honestly fault teacher prep programs for not giving them what they need and ignoring the science. And it is imperative. So I can't say it strongly enough that there has to be a sense of urgency on everyone's part. And we know that we can find these children early. These children, by that I mean these children who are at risk for whatever reason. And we know we can find them. We know what the warning signs are, and we find them as early as possible. We intervene with the very best instruction as early as possible. And then we absolutely change the trajectory for that child. We lower the incidence of reading disabilities and dyslexia, right? So there are a lot of curriculum casualties out there. Has nothing to do with the fact that they have dyslexia. It has everything to do with the fact that the teacher didn't know how to identify the issue and what to do about it. So there's so much to this, and we know so much, and we're not doing what we need to do. We're not taking it seriously enough.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. I really couldn't. So speaking of schools, can you share some of Literacy House success stories in partnering with school districts?
Sure. I'll tell one great success story that I actually was very involved in, and this is a school in Stamford, Connecticut. And Stamford is an interesting district. It's sort of a microcosm of Connecticut because it has two distinct socioeconomic groups. It has middle-class children, but it has fairly affluent children, and then it has very impoverished sector of the city. And the district is really fairly diverse in that respect, linguistically, culturally, socioeconomically, et cetera. So I got a grant from the United States Department of Ed in 2004, $2.9 million grant through the Institute of Education Sciences, which was awesome and so exciting to be able to do our research. And the research was basically learning about what first grade teachers needed to know to teach reading. And we recruited teachers and schools from all over the state. We had 120 teachers in the study, 37 schools. And we randomly assigned the schools to a condition, one where they received professional development and a mentor. And I happened to be a mentor in this case, as well as running the project, and a treatment condition, a control condition where the teachers did not get the professional development until a year later. So they served as a control condition. So it was a really cool study because it was quasi-experimental. It's really hard to conduct research in schools because there's so many variables you can't really control, but we did our darndest, and we got some really nice results. We learned a lot about how to work with first grade teachers and what their students needed to know, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, the school where I was embedded for 2 years, I worked with 7 first grade teachers, gave them a lot of support because the grant covered a mentor in the schools for 2 full years, 1 day a week. Actually, I was there 2 days a week because there were 7 teachers, which is a lot for 1 grade. And after the 2 years, the principal said to me, I my teachers know more than I could ever imagine, and I love the work that you've done with them, and they are so empowered to teach kids. I want you to teach another crop of first grade teachers. And I said, wait, what are you doing with those first grade teachers? She said, well, I'm going to distribute them. I'm going to send some to second grade. They're going to lose the kids from first grade. I'm going to send some down to kindergarten, but you're going to have 7 new first grade teachers to work with. And I said, okay. At first I was questioning the wisdom of that decision, but as it turned out, it was actually a good decision. And I spent next year teaching another group of first grade teachers. And the following year I went to 3rd grade and I went down to kindergarten. I'm still working at this school as a consultant. 14 years later, I'm still there. But after 2 years or 3 years, they went from the lowest performing school in this district of Stamford to the highest performing school. And the principal really thanked me and said a lot of it had to do with what you did for our teachers. And I have to give her credit too, because sometimes we get these great contracts and we're in the school for a year and then they say, great, it was good, we learned a lot, see you later. Mm-hmm. But we know that it takes a long time to change systems. It takes a long time to do the work that we do. And it's just such a wonderful gift when I have an administrator like this one who recognized the value of the work that we did. So, that was a wonderful success story. Another great success story was another district that we worked in, similar to Stamford in terms of demographics. And we were there for several years. And I kept saying, I need research to show that the coaching is making a difference, because we don't have a lot of studies that show that. And I partnered with a research person who helped me develop a mechanism for following a group of teachers that we coached. In this case, it was a group of 3rd grade teachers that we coached over the course of the year, and documenting what we saw in their classroom in terms of instruction, and then taking that group of teachers, students, and measuring their growth over the course of the year and comparing them to a similar group of students whose teachers were not receiving the support that this other cohort of teachers received. And the statistics showed that we made a substantial difference in the students' reading outcome measures compared to the control students. So it was what we'd been looking for a long time. We had some great data from that research study I mentioned a little bit ago, and that also pointed to the fact that the teacher who received the mentoring support, their students outperformed, but we didn't have enough of that sustained data to show what happened over time. So we're constantly trying to make sure that what we're doing is making a difference. We can always point to anecdotal evidence, and we have great testimony from teachers saying that, we changed their lives, that they're able to teach their children to read and they feel empowered, and all sorts of wonderful testimony. But there's nothing that takes the place of quantitative data, and we need that. Because we can't just say, "Oh, we think it's working." That's why we're in the mess we are right now, because we've been doing things for a very long time that people think work, but we know that they don't.
Right. I should have asked in the beginning, but do you have a personal relationship with or connection with dyslexia?
Yes, I actually do. I have several personal connections. Unbeknownst to me, my brother was dyslexic, and I'm one of 6 children. He was an older brother, and I watched him struggle learning to read as a young boy. He ended up being held back. It really impacted his self-esteem, and but I didn't know it because I was a younger sister, so I was probably 4 or 5 at the time. My mother told me I was born to teach, and she said, I just knew the minute I could tell right away you were going to teach. And I had a younger sister. When I went to kindergarten, she was so sad that I left because I was her playmate. I'd come home from school and we'd play school every day. And she went to school 2 years later knowing how to read. And the nun, we were in Catholic school, said, "How did you learn to read?" And she said, "My sister taught me." She was 4.5. Clearly, she didn't have a learning disability. My brother did, and as it turns out, I know for sure. And unfortunately, I didn't know at the time when my dad was alive, but I know he also was dyslexic for lots of reasons I could point to. But then fast forward, and my husband, I diagnosed with dyslexia after a couple of years of marriage. So, he definitely is dyslexic. He's been a very successful businessman, but he absolutely struggles with phonological processing and certain things that are classic signs. And then we have three grown children. One of them has very significant attention deficit. One of them has a nonverbal learning disability, which is different than dyslexia. And one, I would say, is mildly dyslexic. So yeah, I'm surrounded by it's a beautiful thing.
I mean, clearly we're all in this together and for the same reason, because we have a personal connection to dyslexia. So I want to go back to Literacy How, and you have a very interesting business model in that 100% of your proceeds go to funding the Auntie Fowler Foundation, whom you mentioned earlier. Can you tell us more about this foundation and what it does? And, you briefly touched on Ann Fowler, but if there's anything else you wanted to expand on that, please feel free to.
Thank you. Actually love talking about Anne, and I mentioned her earlier as my, the mentor who probably influenced me the most as far as understanding and appreciating the research and the need to apply it. Unlike, I should say, many researchers who stay in their kind of research world, Anne was adamantly, focused on and committed to making sure teachers got this information. She knew it had to be applied. So she was doing all sorts of great work in Connecticut and policy work and working with legislators and working with State Department of Ed folks. And sadly, as I mentioned, she was diagnosed with cancer and she couldn't keep the work going. And I just felt so similarly that I had to keep the work going. And we talked about a teacher training center. We talked about an alternate route to certification. We talked about many different possibilities for taking this work and being able to influence more teachers with the work. And in the end, it was my husband who 5 years ago suggested that I look for a university setting, because he said, you have trouble finding mentors. They are not born. They are, you spend a couple of years, doing a mentoring training program. Wouldn't it be great if you had a pipeline for those mentors? Wouldn't it be great if the districts had pipeline for, their curriculum directors and their directors of special education and their reading specialists, et cetera? And so it made total sense to me. We traveled around the state. We met with a number of different presidents and provosts of universities, and we basically said we wanted to create a model that would be extremely applied, lots of practicum experiences, and very intense. And ideally, recruiting teachers to leave their schools for a year so that they could immerse themselves in these experiences without being distracted by and, just consumed by their day jobs, and then trying to go to school at night and weekends. It just isn't, it's not realistic and get the right results. So we found Fairfield University. They were extremely excited to partner. And we created the Ann Fowler Fellowship based on this mission of ensuring that teachers get good substantive training that includes, and this is where it's super important and distinct from what happens in general at business as usual. Most teachers in our state, and I think this is probably true in yours and most others, they have to get a master's degree within a certain period of time. So they get their undergrad certified teachers, but in Connecticut, 5 years, they have to get a master's. Most of them can't afford to leave their schools to get the master's. So they look for a program that works for them, whatever that means in terms of time, commitment, financial, whatever the issue, whatever the criteria for selection are. They find a school that may or may not be teaching the stuff that they really need, and they don't necessarily know what they need. And so they get master's degrees, but 90% of them will tell us they didn't learn what they needed to learn, but they got the master's degree because they have to, and they get they get a bump in salary, etc. Again, I'm not blaming teachers for this, but I feel strongly that we have to create a new model that gets the right information to them and that makes it affordable and realistic to their lives. And so with my husband's support, we've developed scholarships for these select cohort of fellows each year to be able to afford to leave their jobs. They get a stipend, and then they get most of their courses paid for. And we're about to recruit our fourth cohort of teachers, and it's just been an amazing experience to be part of the evolution of this, and creating a model that we hope to have some good data to show the positive effects so that we can take the model and replicate it elsewhere.
Excellent. So you also talk a lot about accountability and transparency in your fellowship program. So what do you mean by this?
Two really important principles, and I mentioned my husband has been, my biggest fan and champion, and he works in the business world where accountability and transparency reign supreme. And you have data that shows you if it's working, if it's not working, and if it doesn't work, you don't continue. You can't sustain something that doesn't have data to show that it's effective. That's not how businesses operate. So he feel strongly, as I do, that we have to have transparency of data to show, is it working or is it not working? And use that data to inform changes. Okay. So an example of this and accountability. So they're tied together. So, we have accountability built into the fellowship on many different levels. An example of this is we have districts that we are partnering with in our geographic region, and we've made built wonderful relationships and partnerships with key administrators in the district because they sign a memorandum of understanding. We sign an MOU, we Literacy How, or I as the principal at Literacy How, the candidate, the fellow signs the MOU, and Fairfield University signs the MOU. And and there's a set of things that each of those partners agrees to. The district signs the MOU saying that they will allow their teacher to leave for a year and come back and have a position, and that they will allow us access to the data. Because what we do is once the fellow returns to the district, we track their students' progress for 3 years to see if their students are doing better than students whose teachers have not been involved in the fellowship. So they have to agree to giving us access to data. It's declassified. There's no names or people associated with it, but it's just for our purposes of making sure that the program is doing what we want it to do. The Fairfield University signs the MOU, saying that they are going to engage in this partnership, that they're going to provide these practicum experiences, that they will also continue to support the fellows when they leave. So we also have a statement or a clause built into the MOU that says the fellows aren't done after they have coursework for a year, and then they leave, have sabbatical for a year with these embedded practicum experiences. We know that that's not sufficient. It's a lifelong process. So we know that at the minimum 3 years to continue to support them, whatever that may look like. Some of them have gone on to be what we call mentor teachers. So they're mentoring the next cohort of fellows in their classrooms, and that's where the practicum experiences take place. And or they may be an adjunct teaching a course. They could be a practicum supervisor. They could wear many hats. Or if they're not ready to take that, level of responsibility on, then they come back for a refresher course or to participate in a seminar or an institute or whatever it may be. We just know that we have to stay connected to those people. We've invested in them, and we want to continue to invest in them. And so the accountability really is everybody's accountable for doing their part. Everybody's accountable for doing what they signed on to do. The transparency, again, is about the data and looking and being able to have access to data that points to whether or not the program is working. And like I said, there are many elements to it. It's not a simple design by any means. And in fact, one of the things that keeps me awake at night is thinking about how I can and will replicate this when the time is right. Because, for example, I'd love to bring the program to California. Father Paul Fitzgerald, and I know you heard this story, Toby, but Father Paul Fitzgerald was the provost at Fairfield University when my husband and I met with the administrators to pitch this whole idea and this concept. And he was so excited. He loved it and he made it happen there. Unfortunately, he left and went to University of San Francisco, where he is now the president. But my dream is to bring it to University of San Francisco. But the reality is, how do I make that dream come true and keep and maintain the fidelity to the model? Because we're building this group of people that we've interacted with, trained, whatever you want to say. I can't lift them up and place them in California or even Massachusetts, the next state over, easily. And I don't want to water this down. I don't want to compromise. If the model is this and it looks like this and you have to do this, this, and this to get to the right result, then we have to figure out how to make that happen. So those are the big ideas. One other piece that I'll share with you that, again, is relevant probably for you and your group is we have 3 practicum experiences over the course of 12 months for the fellows. The first practicum is in the fall, when they spend the fall every day of the school year working in a mentor teacher's classroom. So a teacher that we believe is really an exemplary teacher, and they work in that teacher's classroom alongside that teacher, and they learn how to apply what they learned the prior year in their coursework. Then they go from that practicum experience to the second practicum experience, which is in the spring, where they we're still trying to figure out one of 2 practicum experiences. Right now, we're doing an after-school dyslexia clinic because that's when the kids can come to us. Right. But ideally, it would happen during the school day, and we have children identified with dyslexia, and they are paired up with a fellow and supervised by somebody with considerable experience in working with children with dyslexia. So I'm actually supervising that practicum this semester because I do have a background. And it's just been an amazing experience to watch the fellows learn this content and apply it and grow, and just what's happening for the students who otherwise wouldn't have these experiences either. So that's the second practicum. The third practicum happens in the summer, and that practicum, they are embedded for 6 weeks in a school in the area for kids with learning disabilities, including dyslexia. And they have another practicum experience delivering Orton Gillingham instruction one-on-one with a student under the supervision of an Orton Gillingham fellow. So you can see how these 3 different practicum experiences build sequentially and deepen their knowledge and their ability to take the evidence based practices that we've been exposing them to and talking to them about and building theoretical knowledge around. And now you're really going to put all of that into
action,
into practice.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. Absolutely. So there's something else that I definitely want to cover. There's actually 2 more things before we close this interview. We were super excited to see that you were doing these reasonably priced eBooks through Kindle. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
I would love to. Yeah, the eBooks. So I don't know, 5 years ago, an organization approached me and said, are you interested in writing your content so that teachers can have it? And it's a long, sordid story in some respects, but it basically got me to the point where I felt that I needed to really manualize, if that's the right way to say it, our practices, our instructional activities, our content. So we do professional development, and ideally when we work with a teacher over the course of a year or 2 years, they come to our professional development, which we deliver once a month here on site. Sometimes we do it in the schools, depending on the number of teachers. And the content is, fairly deep, and we change topics each month so that we can immerse the teacher in that topic for a solid month, go into their classroom and demonstrate the lessons around that topic. And so what we've done with these eBooks, we have 4 right now, and there'll be a 5th one, hopefully sometime, middle to end of next year on comprehension. But we've taken our content and put it into an ebook. We're actually probably going to publish hard copies too, because not all teachers consume material electronically. So we want to give people an opportunity to purchase the book, both ways, depending on what they prefer. But the book really does have a lot of background knowledge about the topic. We have one on phonemic awareness, one on phonics, one on vocabulary, and one on teaching syntax and grammar. There's background, but we try to keep it as simple and as straightforward as possible. Most of the book is really comprised of activities that tie back to that content. So helping teachers and giving them some concrete tools and ideas for what it looks like in the classroom.
Right. So thank you for sharing that. And definitely at the end of this video, we will be providing links to access these ebooks through Kindle, as well as having your website information up. But one last question, because this is a Decoding Dyslexia California interview, and a lot of our chapters pursue legislation. You are based in Connecticut, where there has been quite a bit of dyslexia legislation, including universal screening for students that are at risk for dyslexia. Can you share with us your involvement in working with the Connecticut Department of Education and the Connecticut State Education Resource Center?
I am happy to do that. So as I mentioned, the work that I started in the state as somebody involved in teacher preparation, teacher training, started at Haskins. And at that time, I worked very closely with a woman who was a director of a state agency called the Commission on Children. And Elaine Zimmerman was very committed to passing legislation specific to reading. That was not common in 2000. But she was determined that that was going to happen. And Anne was her partner in crime. And when Anne got sick, I took over and started doing that work and met with Elaine and legislators. So this particular commission actually staffs the legislature. And because it's a commission on children, it staffs the legislature on what are pertinent issues to children in the state. And Elaine was very committed to working on closing the achievement gap and recognizing the fact that Connecticut has one of the largest gaps. We posed and proposed legislation addressing the achievement gap. And each year, we've really built on the prior year's legislation to make it more substantive, to add clauses that speak to accountability, et cetera, to the role of the State Department of Ed, helping support teachers and administrators to ensure that the policies are adhered to and implemented. About 5 years ago, I met Allison Quirian, who's the chapter president here of Decoding Dyslexia. And Allison has a son with dyslexia, as most Decoding Dyslexia folks do. And she was determined that she was going to change the landscape in Connecticut. And because I helped support these legislative policies, including the universal screening policy that you mentioned a little while ago, Allison and I teamed up and said, okay, what can we do to keep moving the ball down the field, if you will, and just keep building on what we've already done foundationally, that's actually quite good, instead of siloing.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And to some extent, it does get siloed, even though you try not to have that happen. I think it's just, what we do as humans. It's just what happens. But, Allison has been incredible figuring out how to work the system being the state legislature that has to have the bills and policies, the State Department of Ed that has to uphold the implementation or the rollout of those policies and bills, the State Education Resource Center that you mentioned, CERC, that does professional development around getting teachers and administrators up to speed on what that looks like and what their role is in making sure that things get done correctly. So I guess the best way to say it is I've just been a partner, and I've tried to bring history sometimes to the table, because I've been doing this now for 18 years, and I do have the history, and I have longstanding relationships with legislators in the caucus. The Black and Puerto Rican caucus have been wonderful, and co-chairs of the Education Committee who respect me and my work, and State Department of Ed officials who also respect the work that I've done. And that's really what it takes, is a partnership. Everybody has their own, sphere that they operate within. But if we stay in those spheres and we don't go outside of them to partner with these other folks that have parts to play in making sure that children get what they need, then it doesn't really work. And even when you have a partnership, there's no guarantee that it's going to work. But at least there's a better chance if you have that.
Right. Well, Margie, we really love your pay it forward concept, and you're doing some great things out there. And we couldn't thank you enough for taking the time to speak with Decoding Dyslexia California today. And we look forward to sharing this interview so more of the parents, educators, and professionals out there that are wanting to learn more about dyslexia can hear about Literacy How and all the great things that you're doing. So thank you so much, Margie.
You are most welcome, Toby. Thanks for inviting me today. And thanks to your colleagues too.
Excellent. Take care.
You too.